For centuries, the world looked at the Gullah Geechee people and thought it understood them. A small, isolated community living on barrier islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, speaking a creole language outsiders called broken English, cooking rice in ways that did not look American, weaving baskets that did not look American either. The story the world told about them was simple: enslaved, isolated, forgotten. That story was wrong, not partially wrong, not missing a few details. Structurally, fundamentally, at the level of origin, wrong. And the thing that proved it was not a historian, it was not an archive, it was not a long-lost document found in a colonial courthouse. It was DNA. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. The Gullah Geechee are descendants of enslaved Africans brought to the Sea Islands, a chain of barrier islands running from North Carolina down through Florida. They were put to work on rice plantations, and then something unusual happened. The islands were physically separated from the mainland. The plantations required such enormous numbers of enslaved workers that black people dramatically outnumbered white plantation owners in this region. That geography created isolation, and the Gullah Geechee used it. They held on to their African cultural heritage more completely than virtually any other black community in the entire United States. Every other enslaved African community in America was stripped over generations of language, of naming practices, of food traditions, of spiritual ritual. The machinery of slavery was designed, in part, to accomplish exactly that, to sever the connection between African people and the cultures they came from, to render them legible only within the terms of the American slave system. The Gullah Geechee survived that machinery, partially, imperfectly, but more completely than anyone else. They kept African names: Sori, Tamba, Kadiatu, Fatimata. They kept rice-centered cuisine, not as a Southern tradition, but as an African one. They kept basket weaving techniques that matched almost exactly the techniques of specific West African peoples. They kept a creole language, Gullah, containing thousands of words derived directly from African languages still spoken today. They kept a song. We will come back to that song, because it is one of the most extraordinary things that ever happened in the history of African American genealogy, and almost nobody knows the story. But first we need to understand the wall. This is not a story about personal failure, not a story about a community that lost track of its history through carelessness or neglect. This is a story about deliberate omission. The transatlantic slave trade moved more than 12 million African people across the ocean between the 16th and 19th centuries. Roughly 2 million died during the Middle Passage alone, making the floor of the Atlantic Ocean the largest graveyard in human history. Of those who survived and arrived in North America, approximately 40 to 65% came through a single port: Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston, the gateway to the Sea Islands, the gateway to the Gullah Geechee world. The ships were documented, the cargo was documented, Africans were listed by age, by approximate region of origin, by perceived physical characteristics, on manifests designed not to preserve identity, but to calculate value. A person was not a person. A person was a unit of labor with a market provenance, no names, no families, no ethnic groups, preserved for the ledger, not for the people. And then the Civil War ended. In 1870, the U.S. government conducted its first census that included formerly enslaved Black Americans as named individuals. That census is often called the 1870 Wall because for genealogists, for anyone trying to trace Black American ancestry beyond that date, it is where the documented record stops cold. Before 1870, the names disappear. The connections to Africa are severed, not by time, but by law, by a system that defined people as property and therefore saw no reason to record their humanity. That is the wall, not a metaphor, a structural historical fact. For the Gullah Geechee, the wall was the same as for every other Black American family. The documents ran out, the names ran out, the trail ran out, but something else survived, something no slave trader could catalog, something no census could erase. The body itself kept the record. Mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child, unchanged generation after generation, in a direct maternal line stretching back tens of thousands of years. It does not recombine. It does not shuffle. It carries mutations at a known rate, allowing scientists to trace human migration across continents and millennia with remarkable precision. For enslaved African descendants, mitochondrial DNA is not just a genealogical tool, it is an act of recovery. It reaches behind the wall. It goes to places no document can go. Beginning in the early 2000s, researchers at Howard University, the Medical University of South Carolina, East Carolina University, and Vanderbilt University Medical Center began conducting systematic genetic studies of Gullah Geechee communities. These were not commercial DNA kits. These were peer-reviewed whole genome studies published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology and Frontiers in Genetics, the kind that go through rigorous methodological scrutiny before a single conclusion is announced. They analyzed autosomal DNA and mitochondrial DNA. They compared results against population reference panels from across Africa, Europe, and the Americas. They were looking for the Gullah Geechee's true origin. What they found complicated everything. For decades, the dominant popular narrative had a clean, satisfying answer to the question of origin. Sierra Leone. The logic was compelling. The Gullah language bears a striking resemblance to Creole, the Creole spoken in Freetown, Sierra Leone, so similar that a Sierra Leonean visiting Gullah country in 1988 could hold conversations with Gullah elders. The names Gullah families preserved, Sori, Tamba, Hawa, Asada, are common Sierra Leonean names. The rice-growing expertise the enslaved Africans brought to the Sea Islands matched the traditions of specific ethnic groups along the Sierra Leone coast. Bunce Island, a British slave castle on the Sierra Leone River, was a major documented departure point for ships heading to Charleston. The Sierra Leone connection felt like an answer, a specific, beautiful, emotionally powerful answer. Gullah people made 3 celebrated homecoming journeys there in 1989, 1997, and 2005. Acts of recognition, acts of reunion. And then the DNA arrived. The genetic studies confirmed the Sierra Leone connection, but then went further, much further. They replaced a single clean answer with something far more complex and far more historically accurate. The Port of Charleston's own records showed the actual breakdown. Approximately 39% of enslaved Africans came from West Central Africa, present-day Angola, Congo, and Gabon, 20% from Senegambia, 17% from the Windward Coast, 13% from the Gold Coast, only 6% from Sierra Leone itself. The DNA reflected this history faithfully. Researchers found that while the Gullah showed a slightly closer genetic relationship to Sierra Leone populations than other African American groups, validating the cultural connection, their actual genomic ancestry was distributed across many West and Central African populations: the Mende of Sierra Leone, the Mandinka of Senegal, populations from Angola and the Congo, groups from the Gold Coast. The Sierra Leone narrative was not wrong. It was incomplete. The Gullah Geechee were not the descendants of one people. They were the confluence of many, drawn from thousands of miles of African coastline, speaking different languages, practicing different traditions, arriving on different ships in different decades, and forging something entirely new in the isolation of the Sea Islands. And here is the number that makes everything else land. Their African ancestry tested at over 90%. Most other African American communities carry between 70 and 80% African ancestry due to centuries of admixture. The Gullah Geechee had maintained a genetic closeness to Africa nearly unparalleled in the Western Hemisphere. That was the first revelation. The second one cut deeper. In December 2025, a peer-reviewed study published in Advances in Clinical Medicine Research reaffirmed the Gullah Geechee's significance to Black American history entirely. The research team at Pennington Biomedical Research Center at Louisiana State University analyzed mitochondrial DNA haplogroups from 189 participants, including 79 Gullah Geechee individuals and 110 general African Americans. A haplogroup is a cluster of genetic variants marking shared maternal ancestry, a fingerprint left by the ancient mothers who founded a lineage passed down unchanged through every daughter and granddaughter across centuries. Among the Gullah Geechee, L2 and L3 haplogroups dominated, the foundational maternal lineages of sub-Saharan Africa. More significantly, non-L haplogroups associated with European and Native American ancestry were essentially absent in the Gullah Geechee sample, less than 2% compared to the general African American population, which showed measurably higher rates of European maternal admixture. On the maternal line, through the mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, the Gullah Geechee preserved an African genetic signature maintained across 300 years of American history. The isolation of the Sea Islands had not just preserved culture, it had preserved biology. But then the study goes further, into territory that changes everything. The researchers proposed a hypothesis the broader scientific community is now taking seriously. The Gullah Geechee may be progenitors, founding ancestors, of the broader African American maternal lineage across North America. Think about what that means. When enslaved Africans were first brought to South Carolina and Georgia in massive numbers in the early 1700s, the Sea Islands became one of the largest concentrations of African people on the continent. As the domestic slave trade expanded and enslaved people were sold further inland, further north, further south, they carried their genetics with them. The Gullah Geechee weren't just a community in isolation. They were a source, a root population. The study found statistically shared maternal ancestry between the Gullah Geechee and the broader African American population, a shared signal in the haplogroup distribution suggesting common origin. In other words, when millions of Black Americans open a DNA report that traces their maternal line back to West or West Central Africa, they may be following a thread that passes at some point through the Sea Islands, through women whose names were never recorded, whose humanity was assessed in dollars. The Gullah Geechee were not a footnote to Black American history. They may have been the beginning of it. There is a story that does not appear in any genetics paper, but it belongs here because it is the human face of everything the science confirmed. In 1933, a Black linguist named Lorenzo Dow Turner traveled to a coastal village south of Savannah, Georgia, documenting the Gullah language. In that village, he met an elderly woman named Amelia Dawley. While his recording device ran, Amelia Dawley sang a song. She did not know what the words meant. She had never known. The song had been passed from mother to daughter, through slavery, through emancipation, through Jim Crow, and somewhere along the way, the meaning had been lost. All that remained was the sound, the shape of words, a melody carried in the body long after the mind had forgotten what it was carrying. Turner recorded it and filed it away. Decades passed. In 1990, an anthropologist named Joseph Opala played Turner's recording for a Sierra Leonean ethnomusicologist named Cynthia Schmidt. Schmidt immediately recognized something. She went to Sierra Leone. She searched, and in a remote village in the interior of the country, she found a woman named Bandu Jabati, who was still singing the same song, not a similar song, the same song. It was a funeral song in the Mende language, spoken in Sierra Leone, that had survived the Middle Passage, the auction block, American slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. It survived for over 200 years inside the memory of a family that no longer knew what it meant or where it came from. The words had outlasted the language itself. The blind, 90-year-old chief of that Sierra Leonean village said, "You can identify a person's tribe by the language they cry in." The song contained 50 words in Mende. Researchers called it almost certainly the longest text in an African language ever preserved by an African American family. When Alex Haley traced his roots to the Gambia for Roots, the book that shook American culture, he was led there by 5 or 6 words in Mandinka. Amelia Dawley's family preserved 50. The thread had not been cut. It had been hidden in plain sight inside a song no one living could explain. The science did not return only beautiful things. The same studies also revealed male-biased European admixture, a finding that appears in the genetic research with clinical detachment but carries enormous moral weight. Male-biased admixture means that when European genetic material entered the Gullah Geechee population, it came disproportionately through the paternal line, not through partnership, not through choice. It came through the systematic sexual violence of plantation slavery, violence that was not, by law, defined as violence at all because the people it was committed against were defined as property. The European admixture in the Gullah Geechee is lower than in most other African American communities, below 10% in many Sea Island communities compared to the 30% average seen further inland. One more artifact of the islands providing a kind of protection, however imperfect. But the admixture exists, and the data tells us exactly what pathway it took. The science cannot name names. It cannot prosecute crimes that happened 300 years ago, but it confirms the pattern across a whole population, across generations. The genetic record shows what the legal record was designed to conceal, that rape was not an aberration of the slave system. It was an instrument of it. The science made the general truth undeniable. The specific truth remained sealed. Before the DNA studies, the Gullah Geechee were understood as a remarkable but isolated community, a preservation story, a community that held on. After the DNA, the picture is larger, more consequential. The genetic evidence suggests the Gullah Geechee represent a founding biocultural population for legacy African Americans across North America, a root community, a people whose maternal lineages may run through millions of Black American families who have no idea they are connected to the Sea Islands, to the rice fields, to the Mendy song. More than 1 million Americans may have ancestral ties to the Gullah Geechee community. Most of them don't know it. In late 2024, underwater sonar technology mapped 45 previously unknown irrigation structures on Eagles Island in North Carolina, earthen dams and levees covering over 2,000 acres, built by Gullah Geechee people to control water flow for rice fields. The engineers were enslaved. Their names were never recorded, but their work is still there. Still mappable, still measurable, still undeniable. More land was moved to build the South Carolina rice plantation system than was moved to build the pyramids at Giza. That is not a metaphor. That is an engineering fact. The Gullah Geechee built it with knowledge they brought from Africa, with techniques the people who enslaved them did not possess. They were the technical foundation of the economy that made to the American South's wealth possible. They brought the crop. They built on the infrastructure, and then they were rendered invisible by design. DNA is rendering them visible again. Here is what the science can confirm. The what, the where, in broad strokes. The when with probabilistic accuracy. What it cannot do is name anyone. It cannot tell Amelia Dawley's descendants which village in Sierra Leone her ancestor was taken from. The African database of genetic variation is still incomplete. Over 30% of Gullah Geechee mitochondrial DNA sequences in one major study had no perfect match in a database of over 4,000 African variants. This is not a failure of science. It is a consequence of the same injustice the science is trying to undo. Africa has been chronically underrepresented in global genetic databases. The populations most relevant to African American genealogy are precisely the ones whose genetic profiles have been least collected and cataloged. The 2025 study authors were explicit. Their findings were a pilot investigation, a beginning. What remains unresolved is not a gap in knowledge. It is a moral debt. Here is what DNA revealed about the Gullah Geechee people. They were not a single people. They were many peoples. Mende, Angolan, Senegambian, Fula, Kissi, Temne, Mandinka, Baga, forced together on isolated islands, forced to forge a common language and culture out of fragments of everything they had each carried across the ocean. What emerged was not diluted, it was concentrated, a new identity built on the bones of many ancient ones. They were not isolated survivors, they were founders. Their maternal lineages may run through millions of Black American families who have never heard the word Gullah. They were not unskilled laborers. They were agricultural engineers who transformed the American landscape with knowledge the people who enslaved them did not possess. And they kept a song for 200 years in a language they could no longer speak. They kept it in the body, the way the body keeps its DNA without being asked to, without knowing it was doing it, just passing something forward in the dark on the chance that one day someone would know what it meant. DNA reveals origin. It cannot determine belonging. It can tell you where a lineage began. It cannot tell you what it means to be the person who carries it. That meaning, what the Gullah Geechee made out of what was done to them, what they built, what they produced, what they passed forward is not in any haplogroup. It is in a basket, in a recipe, in a word for sweet that sounds exactly the same in coastal Georgia and coastal Sierra Leone. Here's the question I want to leave you with. If millions of Black Americans are descended through their maternal lines from the Gullah Geechee, from women whose names are unknown, who raised children in slavery and somehow kept a culture alive that should not have survived, what does that debt look like? Not the historical debt everyone already knows about, the specific debt to a specific people who may, genetically speaking, be the mothers of Black America. Science resolve where they came from. Science cannot tell us what we owe them. That question belongs to us. If this video opens something for you, share it. The Gullah Geechee story is one of the most important and least told in American history. In the comments right now, did you know about the Gullah Geechee before today? And if you are a Black American, are you going to look into whether you might be connected? Drop it below.